Okay, so hello and welcome to today's RGE Knowledge Bites for Business webinar. I'm Sarah Hillier and I'm Head of Business Development at Robert Gordon University, for those of you who don't know me already. Before we get started with today's discussion, I just wanted to draw your attention to our housekeeping slide, which is in front of you at the moment, to make sure that we all have an enjoyable session today. The key thing to note is that we welcome your questions throughout the webinar and ask that you post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll ask Steve at the end of his talk, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. But if we do have lots, Steve has offered to answer them afterwards if need be. So today we have an RGU alumni joining us, Steve Ray. And many of you will know Steve as an Executive Director for Step Change in Safety. He's also a big supporter of RGU and works closely with some of our business school colleagues on various initiatives. Steve has an incredible story to share as he is a Piper Alpha survivor. And this, along with other 35 years of industry experience, has provided him with a unique perspective on safety, culture, effective team leadership, and engagement across all levels of the workforce. So I'm sure today's talk is going to be very interesting, particularly as the title for his presentation is A Brief Story About Learning How to Dance in the Rain. So I'll now pass over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Good afternoon to you all, and let me start by thanking Claire and Sarah at RGU for inviting me to share my story with you today. I'm going to assume you're all familiar with who I am, my career highlights and my background. But just for the record, I am Steve Ray. I was born and bred in Aberdeen. I'm currently the Executive Director with Step Change in Safety and the Chairman of the Pound for Piper Trust. Who am I? And what I currently do is really not what this story is about. It's more about how the unpredictability of life and its challenges, as harrowing as they may be, can be overcome, and in my case, better prepare us for the future. Through sharing my experience, I want to help you see beyond these uncertain times brought about by the storm that is COVID, with the hope that you will take something away that will help you to see through the clouds to better times ahead. My story is about overcoming adversity as a teenager, a young man, a father, and an aspiring manager. In fact, I still pinch myself when I consider how it came to be, as life has been far from straightforward for me from a very early age. So let's start in a traditional way. Once upon a time, there was a young lad living in a council estate with his 4 siblings and his loving parents. He felt loved, secured, and wanted for very little. His journey to teenage years had been idyllic in many ways. At the age of 13, all that changed. On the 7th of February 1976, he experienced his first life storm that would last for a few years. That young lad I was talking about is me. My father died very suddenly that morning and brought my world and the world of my 4 siblings and my mother crashing to the ground. The full spectrum of loss, grief, anger, resentment, and guilt was upon us all. We all took the loss of my father differently. We never really got over it. I withdrew from normal life and just wanted to put my head in the sand. I certainly did not want to be a burden to my mother. She had to pick up the pieces and support the upkeep of the house, with 3 of us still of school age. These were indeed very tough times for her. I was drawn closer to my schoolmates, some of whom were, let's say, more streetwise than I was. They did what teenagers did then. They experimented, they pushed the boundaries of the laws. I went along with it. I had to. I wanted to fit in. I came close, very close to going off the rails completely. It was the thought of letting my mother down and tarnishing the family name that eventually led me to withdraw from my hoodlum mates, some of whom would eventually find themselves in police custody. They responded by ostracizing me, not a great place to be as a teenager. However, it happened, and thankfully it pushed me to establish a new outlook on life, which in time brought me to a new circle of friends. Being ostracized would prove to be a blessing in disguise. It was about this time that I decided that if I was going to make a success of life, I had better pick myself up and get on with it. I had to develop a sense of determination. My parents had given their all selflessly to bring us up. It was time for me to pick myself up and build on the foundation they had laid for me. I became very determined and a very young and driven individual. Work ethic, something that I have had since this early years and continue to have this year, a very strong work ethic. I knew money was tight. Both parents worked hard, worked long hours and weekends too, just to keep us. I realized my mother would work herself into the ground just to keep us. I could not let this happen. I needed to contribute. I secured 2 part-time jobs at the age of 13, which required a very strong work ethic, a can-do attitude. I also realized I needed to get my school grades to secure an apprenticeship, as university was now out of my reach. Gone were my dreams of becoming an architect. I set myself about by moving to a goal-setting regime, as I learned to call it later on in life. I set my goals short-term, mid-term, and even long-term. I mapped my way to a better place in my head as a teenager. They were all related to self-preservation, self-development, and most importantly, reducing the burden on my mother. In time, I soon had financial independence, a recognized trade, possessions such as a car, sports equipment, audio equipment, amongst other material possessions that late teenagers would like to have. Achieving these goals served to motivate me to set more goals, bigger goals, and this approach served me well through my mid to late teens. Looking back, I realized I had emerged from a troubled period in my life. I had learned to dance in the rain for the first time. The clouds were gone. However, the sense of loss would never leave me. On completion of my apprenticeship, and now in my late teens, I wasted no time in chasing better paid work. I changed jobs against the advice of my mother. My optimistic view had meant that I had underestimated the volatile nature of the employment market in the 1980s, which within months left me without a full-time job. Thankfully, my apprenticeship, my trade stood me in good stead, and I had picked up another job in a short period of time and was now entering my 20s. I continued to chase my dream of offshore work. My mates were earning way beyond me doing labouring jobs offshore. I was desperate to follow them, but in a skilled position. My likeable character, my can-do attitude always came good, and eventually I got the break I so desperately wanted. Offshore work, this was one of my calculated risks. At 21, I took up agency work, working on many offshore installations. My work ethic and positive outlook kept me in work, although I did have to pull in many favours to avoid the slumps. They were frequent in the 80s. That said, I did also incur some unemployment time during those 80s. You can see from the slide I've shown you that I had worked on a huge amount of installations, a vast amount of installations in a very short period of time. These were all fairly prolific in the 1980s. In 1985, I happened to find myself work on the Alwyn North, which was a brand new platform. It helped me find my feet again, and I was doing well. Steady job, my own flat, a healthy social life, and money to spend. That said, I wanted out of the agency work I was currently doing. I wanted a staff job and the perks to go with it. These were all part of my goal-setting regime. I knew what I wanted, and I knew if I thought about it hard enough, it would come to me. With offshore experience under my belt, I could chase staff jobs. Eventually, the offer arrived from a company called Bawden Drilling. I had heard they were a good company and they had plenty of work. So in January 1988, I decided to make the change. That was me set for the long term. My perseverance and persistence had paid off. I now had satisfied two of my bigger goals and secured a staff position offshore. As I said, I felt I was set. 5 months later, in July of 1988, my second major storm took me by surprise. Piper Alpha. On the 6th of July, 1988, I arrived back on Piper Alpha for my third trip. I had made a positive impression in my first two trips and had integrated well and quickly with my new co-workers. The drillers were such a great bunch of guys. They had such a strong can-do attitude, and they were very hard-working, and they had some real characters in there. It was a joy to be amongst them. On 10 o'clock of that night, everything changed. A storm like no other arrived. What happened that night changed me in so many ways. There would be 167 lives lost tragically that night. There had been 225 people on board that installation. Only 60 would survive. I was fortunate to be one of those 60. I actually believed I survived because of my life experiences to date, my determination, my sense of self-preservation, and most importantly, because I knew I was going to be a father later that year. I could not let my child grow up without a father. I had done so and would not wish it on anyone. As luck would have it, I survived. Not easily, but I survived. The next few months, in fact, longer than months, years, would be difficult for me. Guilt returned, anger certainly returned, and frustration had returned. The more I found out about Piper and its owners Occidental, the more angry and frustrated I would become. My livelihood was now in question. Many of my dreams were shattered. Could I really go back offshore? Would I really be employable? People were talking about PTSD, effectively ruining people's careers. Was I really damaged goods? How would I know? My employer was extremely good to me. They kept me whole in salary until the arrival of my firstborn, my first son. The time had come. I knew I had to sort myself out. As I said, my employer may have been excellent and looked after me, but I had to do something. I had to get back on the horse. So my employer arranged to fly me out. I should have clicked these slides before. This is just Piper in its dying days, if you wish. As I was saying, my employers had stuck by me. They truly helped me. And come the arrival of my son in January of 1989, they asked if I would consider going offshore again. I decided I would give it a go. They arranged a helicopter for myself and two of my managers. I flew out to Beatrice, 12 miles out. And fortunately for me, the trip, it was only a day trip, went well. I knew some of the people on Piper, not on Piper, on Beatrice, and it was good to see old friends. And returning to the heliport, I actually believed I could do this. One of the main reasons for doing this was I wanted to put the demons of Piper to bed. I couldn't let Piper beat me. So from there on, I ended up with a job in the office in the engineering group. I never looked back. I took every opportunity to throw my company through at me. I learned quickly and was soon singled out for development. I had the good fortune of being mentored by some great men. I spent 20 years with Noble Drilling. They had purchased Borden Drilling. Like many companies that were involved on Piper, they had went under with the financial strain. Noble Drilling were very good to me. Their development program was excellent for those aspiring managers. It was known as the Noble Way. I had the good fortune of being mentored by some very good men at Noble Drilling. And sadly, it took a toll on my relationship. It failed, but I was insistent I would remain a father to my son, which to this day I have been. Outside of my direct family, this was my first selfless act of caring and commitment. My son meant everything to me. I had not been someone who would be typically selfless in the past. I was so driven and determined to do well for myself. I've now felt like my life was on fast forward. I had learned to dance again. I met another woman and married soon after. My second son arrived in 1990 and was to be followed by 3 more sons in 92, 94 and 96. I did all I could to bury my association with Piper deep in my head, as I still felt ashamed, tainted, and I rarely talked about it openly. My career took a turn for the better, and I was provided with some excellent in-house training, supervisory and management training. My ability to get things done got me noticed. My manager, my mentor, told me I could progress no further without a degree. This would bring me to Robert Gordon's University. Before doing so, I thought to myself, I'm done. I've reached the ceiling of my capacity, and I've still got many goals to satisfy. I was devastated. So I asked if they would sponsor me. And the response I got was, we will not sponsor you, but we will refund you every penny that you pay toward your degree if you pass. What an incentive for a goal-orientated, determined individual. So I enrolled with the assistance of my company. I enrolled into an international MBA program. This would test me to the limits. I had been out of education since I had been 16 years old. I now had 5 young sons under the age of 9. I had a full-time job and a work assignment which involved special projects as part of my development program. As the saying goes, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. Well, I was that busy person. For 4 years, I ground it out. I recognized I was developing skills and the ability to manage staff, finances, resources, and all the time my interpersonnel skills, project management skills were improving. I just sucked it up. It was not easy, but I was driven, determined, and obsessed by progression. It became obvious that as I delivered on special projects, the next one would be more complex and more challenging. I ended up working in Africa, Russia, Middle East, Europe, one after the other. All this while studying. I graduated with my MBA and only just after a second extension to my thesis period. In 2000, the company stood good and gave me a senior role, paid back my fees, and I was now in operations with advancement in front of me. Sadly, my marriage suffered, and the same year I filed for divorce. Another major storm had arrived. This would test my family commitment more than my career. I could not be an absent father or weekend dad. It was out of the question, as all I had been through was primarily to provide a good life for my family. And it's what my mum and dad had done for me. It was tough, shared residency, a new job, and an international project to complete. Something would give. It would have to. A year later, I met the love of my life. We connected immediately. She would soon become a devoted stepmom. I completed my project and assumed responsibility for Noble Drilling's platform business in the UK. There was still international travel required, but only 3 times a year. We made it work. My boys settled into the shared residency arrangements we had agreed with their mothers, and the storm passed. It was now 2002. I started to talk openly about my Piper experience. I would use it when talking with my staff, the offshore crews and my clients. I did so with authenticity, as I truly wanted to prevent anything like Piper happening again. It allowed me to connect personally with the workforce. I became insistent that safety was non-negotiable. This fitted with the Noble Drilling's values perfectly. However, it did not land so well with some folks in the industry. I was not to be ignored. My position provided me with influence, my experience provided me with the motivation, and my story was truly authentic and impactful. In 2005, I was promoted to the North Sea Operation Manager. This saw me become involved at an industry level through step change in safety, where I joined the leadership team. I also became the chairman for the International Association of Drilling Contractors in the North Sea. I started to make reference to my Piper experience at these forums. Finally, after all these years, my self-inflicted silence on Piper could be removed, and it left me in a position to influence the industry's safety agenda. I found it strange, but few people at executive level really knew that I had happened to be a survivor. When it did become known, many said it made perfect sense, as they had wondered how I had been so vocal and committed to safety. I was taken aback by the response, and even more so by the impact it had on larger audiences. On the 20th anniversary of Piper, I took my talk on the road. I went to universities, colleges, and did press interviews. I had weathered many storms, travelled that less travelled road, and learned to dance in the rain. These attributes and life experiences have served me well through the last 12 years. As I've established new businesses both nationally and internationally, the combined learning from adversity, survival, and management development has worked well for me. Why? I believe it's because I make every effort to be authentic, I make it personal, and keep people clearly in focus. It allows me to go back to an industry that has been very good to me. I actually believe I'm paying back for all that I've earned in my days. On my return to Aberdeen in 2018, I found employment easily and took a senior position with a startup company. This was an exciting year for me and one that I really enjoyed. The work was very motivating, but I was back in operations and my heart was not truly there. During my time overseas, I had kept in touch with Step Change in Safety and often thought I would be ideally suited to lead that organisation. I was not only an optimist, I was a believer that things happen for a reason. And in early 2019, I happened to be attending a business breakfast at the Marklift, where I had a chance conversation with Kirsten Gove, the head of comms at Step Change in Safety. She had mentioned that they may be looking for a new executive director at the time. A few months later, I took up my position as Step Change in Safety's executive director. I believe it's the perfect role for me, and I believe I am the perfect fit for that role. It was a full-on year in 2019 as it came to a close. Multiple events to deliver, staff to find, a team to build, a 2020 plan to develop, and most importantly, members to win over. The 2019 plan was rolled out. I added the last new members to the team, and a long staff member, Gillian Simpson, had returned from extended leave. I was thinking, we've got this. We've got this. We've got a team. We're going to get this. We're going to deliver it. Not quite. COVID-19 hit the UK, and it brought confusion and uncertainty in bucket loads. A new storm had truly arrived. It would affect everyone this time. And it was time for myself and my team to revisit our dance lessons. As we entered March 2020, people started talking about lockdown, and the pace of change was incredible. My thoughts were, what if this gets offshore? We need to make the workforce aware of the implications. We need to communicate the need to remain focused on safety while sharing information on COVID, as it's clear that the government are focused on the impact at the national level onshore. Lockdown Day announced we were halfway through recording 7 videos, all related to COVID-19 and its potential impact offshore. We finished the last one of the 7 videos the day before we headed home. We set up home office working, which was all new to us. My relatively new team headed their separate ways, and I have to rethink now, how do we bond remotely? I may add, we're not alone. The entire nation is heading home and has been home for a year now. So I don't single us out. I just try to explain how difficult it is for a new team to bond when you have to do so remotely. My team were amazing and still are. They all stepped up. We talked daily, we responded to our members, the workforce, and ramped up our media channel announcements. We also had to launch a new website, which had been finalised in April. We knew what we had to do. We were absolutely committed, and we've made the best of a bad year last year. This year, we have approached it completely differently. We've embraced change. We've adapted. We became determined. We introduced a themed approach to safety for the industry, and will do so on a quarterly basis. So here we are as we enter the second quarter of 2021. We are practicing our new dance moves as we continue to learn to dance in the storm. Throughout my talk, I've mentioned some topics that I believe are instrumental in making me who I am and should not go unnoticed. I think if we all take heed of some of these, we will be astonished how we can cope with the most adverse of conditions and situations we find ourselves in. From an early age, I developed a very strong sense of determination. I recognized that education was one of the key components in delivering on my goals, whether it be secondary, technical, or management. An absolute strong work ethic is essential if you are to do well in your chosen career. You have to learn to be selfless. Giving back is as important as receiving. There are those that need to be recognized and assisted. You absolutely have to develop a commitment to care for one another and your colleagues. In my approach, I developed a very goal-orientated approach to life. It has worked for me. It may not be for everyone, but I suggest if you truly want to achieve something, you commit it to paper and memory, and you revisit it regularly. Self-development for me was a key instrument in getting me to where I was. I rarely sat on my laurels and thought, this is where I want to be. I've managed to bring up 5 wonderful young men. I've held a interesting career path and held some very stressful positions that I have been fortunate to enjoy for the most. The most important part in me achieving what I have done and what I plan to do with Step Change and Safety is I approached my life from a very young age with bucket loads of optimism in the darkest of times. And I've also practiced and continue to practice this day a sense of a positive mental attitude. So with that, I want to bring my talk to a close, and I'll happily respond to any questions that you may have for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was a really fascinating talk. You have incredible resilience and strength, and your sons, who I think some are maybe listening today, must be incredibly proud of you as well. So thank you for sharing your story with us. We have got a couple of questions coming through, but I will encourage anyone to get their questions using the Q&A function, and I'll ask them to Steve. Maybe I'll just take the opportunity from myself, because being chair, I get that chance to do. Steve, Is there anything that you would change looking back in your life? Is there, you obviously came to a few junctures and there's things that you could have completely changed. Is there anything that you would have done differently?
Yes, there is. I'm not one for looking backwards, Sarah, but there is. I think my mother was a very cautious individual, I would say, and there was times when she cautioned against some of the things I did and I went on to do. I'll not mention them. There's several. God bless her, she's not with us anymore. But I think I would have probably changed a couple of those things if I could have. And it's amazing how you just have to change the small things early in life and they may well change your complete journey. I think I'll tell you one actually. My father had secured a bursary for me at, believe it or not, for Robert Gordon's secondary school. And coming from a council estate, it wasn't particularly frequent that children from that area went into Robert Gordon's. I was devastated. My parents were excited. I was devastated. My eldest sister had went to the Girls' High on a bursary. And I remember imploring my father not to make me go. And he did. He recognised there was no point in forcing me to go to school I really didn't want to go to. Mm-hmm. So perhaps that would have changed my path slightly, but who would have known?
Yeah, you just don't know. But I think you probably, sounds like the decisions you've made in the end have all been worked out well for you anyway.
Well, in some force, but I think I've made the best of some really challenging situations, I guess is how I would play that one.
Definitely. I've got a question here from Mark Cowson. He says, "Hey Steve, great presentation as usual. Thanks for sharing your story. If you had a time machine that took you back to the day before your first offshore trip, what is the one piece of wisdom that you would share with a young Steve Ray?" Great question.
So I've got hindsight here because I had the opportunity to spend some time with a graduate from the apprenticeship program in Opito. And I got talking to this young lad and I said to him, what advice would you have liked the first day you went offshore that you didn't appreciate and never asked for? And he said, I'd been doing my apprenticeship and I'd learned to use spanners and tools for things that I could fit in my hand. He said, my first day offshore, I was faced with bolts the size of my head, and I really didn't appreciate the enormity and the scale of change from being an apprentice to a technician. Mm-hmm. So on my first day offshore, it was somewhat uneventful because the first rig I ever stepped on, I literally stepped on. It was at the quayside at Peterhead. And it was towering above the quayside, and I was going up to work in the pontoons. And I remember I was going in to do some temporary lighting or something like that. And they opened a hatch and said, in you go, because we need the lights on before anything happens. Well, those tanks, these pontoon tanks, had been filled with muddy water for months and months. So within minutes, I was disillusioned as to the excitement and grandeur of working offshore. I hope that answers Mark's question.
Perfect, thank you. Good question now from Dan Burney. Great presentation, such a candid personal journey. Thanks for sharing. If there was one area of the current safety environment which you feel still hasn't developed as positively as it should have, what is that? And what do you think we could do more in that space?
That's a great question, Dan, and thank you for that. So for me, one thing springs to mind immediately. I think we are very poor as an industry at sharing lessons learned or even sharing them. There have been certainly some significant events, not to the scale of Piper, but certainly with the potential to be a Piper, that have happened in our industry that for reasons of that legal people can speak to are not shared openly. And I think we lose a huge opportunity to learn as an industry for those coming into this industry. And I canvass regularly for legal privilege to be dropped. And I think companies could do much more by allowing these to be shared in safe spaces or so on and so forth. That's the saddest part of our industry, who are great at collaborating and sharing, but they are so protective of their own individual instance. Sarah, I think that's the thing I would change the most.
Yeah. And I guess as well, thinking about the wider offshore energy sector as well, there's, so much that could be learned from oil and gas that could be transferred into offshore renewables as well. I know it's Slightly different in that you don't have accommodation offshore for offshore renewables, but there'll still be applications.
And I think talking on that vein, there isn't truly a collaborative approach between, for example, the wind industry and the offshore hydrocarbon industry right now. I think there's work to be done there as well. I'm on that space. Let's call it slow progress, but I think there's an opportunity for us to learn. There's so many similar activities.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with that. Thank you. A question from Sarah. I feel the Piper Alpha disaster must have been very traumatic for you. May I ask who you utilised to build your resilience and also how you managed to overcome the incident? What tips do you have for that to be able to get up and carry on, and even to get back on an offshore installation afterwards? How did you overcome the fear? I think that really impressed me as well, Steve, that you were able to go back offshore after that happening.
Yeah, well, I think I may have touched on it briefly. I had wanted to be offshore for so long for very sort of selfish reasons, monetary reasons, time off reasons, and it was a great lifestyle. And I'd geared my whole life around that lifestyle. And when it was taken away from me so promptly and brutally, I kind of got to a place very quickly where I was like, okay, so is this going to really stop me doing what I want to do? And I had time to reflect on that. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But as far as how do you overcome, or how do you recover from such a traumatic incident as that? I know that in the wake of Piper, you can imagine I'd lost something in the region of 26 colleagues and many, many more people who I had to work with on Piper. And I got to a place where I'd attended so many services and funerals that I felt myself becoming negatively affected. Let's just say, put it that way. And I had to draw that line and go, I need to start looking after myself instead of doing the right thing for people who have been bereft or lost. And that was when I decided to detach myself from the whole association with Piper. I didn't attend any Piper outreach meetings for survivors. I didn't particularly read about it. I didn't talk about it. And I made a conscious decision to look forward instead of back. And it's only, I say only, it's probably in the last 15 years really that I started to be able to talk about it openly, be more reflective around it. And what I would say, and this may come as quite a surprise to many on the call, the book Fire in the Night was published, I believe, in 2013 perhaps, which would have been maybe the 25th anniversary. I only finished it 2 nights ago because I just couldn't pick it up and read what was in it. And the most poignant part of that whole thing is the author of the book, Stephen McGinty, had written a personal message inside the inside cover, which I had never read, so I had never replied. And I felt so awful because he'd taken the time to write a personal message. So I think I dealt with it and became resilient. I think my resilience was already high as a result of losing my father so young. There's nothing like that to build your resilience. And I just was determined, as I said before, that this would not dictate how my life would go forward, although it has in a different positive sort of way. So there's no real answer apart from me. I rarely look in the rear view mirror, and I have a very future focused approach to life, Sarah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I guess everybody's going to be different in how they deal with that, but having that determination is certainly, and you spoke about that as well, as that impacted how you survived the disaster was because of your drive and determination that you had originally.
Yeah, and as far as the helicopter trips, the first one was always going to be the hardest one, and it was 12 miles out. I'd been there before, so in and out, not overnight. But I'm actually planning to go back offshore again this year. I was off in December last year. I made it, how can I be authentic to the workforce if I'm not prepared to put myself in the hazardous environment they work in? I think that has to be part of the step change way, that if you're going to lead by example, you have to put your boots on the ground.
Mm-hmm. This question maybe in relation, you've maybe slightly answered it, but it's from Ruth. She's asking, you mentioned in your talk about your ability, even in the darkest of times, to maintain optimism. what would be your advice to people who perhaps as a result of the pandemic are struggling in the face of adversity to see opportunity or a way through?
Again, a very sort of, it's personal for everyone, Sarah. I tend to think that this will end. We don't know how it will end. We don't know what restrictions will be in place. And I think in most things in life, people have a fear of change or an uncomfortable error around change. I think I live in a place, because of my experience, that I know change is inevitable. And I know there are some things we can't control. But what I would say is what we've done as a family, and in the main, is we've owned the things we can control: distancing, sanitizing, and so on and so forth. We've not been 100% legal. I don't think anyone has actually, but we've taken what I would call calculated and controlled risks. My wife is a business as well. So we've acted accordingly. We've planned as best we can to keep ourselves and our close ones healthy. I think you have to see the light at the end of the tunnel, as far away as it might be, and believe that there are better days ahead. And I think that's how I approach most adverse situations in life, actually.
Mm-hmm. Good advice. Another question for you. Companies in the UK are now very safety conscious, as you well know. How would you advise companies elsewhere in the world where safety may be more reactive than proactive?
So my 8 years abroad, where I spent a good deal of time living and working in South America and also in North America, I saw firsthand how safety was approached. And I was staggered, to say the least. I think there are huge gains to be had, and they're not difficult. I genuinely think it takes a mindset change. And if I think about my time in Brazil, the biggest obstacle to safe operations in Brazil was the culture. They are a very a dictatorial culture where you get told to do something, you don't question, you do it. And in my time in Brazil, I went offshore in Brazil as well. I engaged personally with the workforce. I ended up being the chair of the Aiming High group, which was all about safety. It was effectively a step change version of in Brazil. And when you got individuals around the table, working individuals with their supervisors and their bosses, it was amazing to see the change. I use the term in some of my talks, it was transformational, because it is transformational when people appreciate that they can have a say. It's not necessarily difficult, it's not necessarily expensive, it's just about the cultural change. It was the same in North America when I visited land drilling sites. Some of the behaviours I saw that would not have been condoned by any executive were being undertaken by those at the rig site because they thought it was efficient and it would get them to the next job quicker. So I think it's a mindset, it's a culture. I think we have some excellent tools in our library that are readily transferable, and I've used them abroad, so I know they work.
Definitely. Just keep spreading the word. Great presentation. This is a question from Harold Benning. Great presentation. Are you concerned that with the existing aging infrastructure in the North Sea, companies might be facing major incidents? And what do you believe operators need to do to mitigate this?
So I believe many of our assets, the majority of assets, are operating beyond their intended life. I think in the main they are being well inspected and being, certainly the safety critical systems are being maintained. I have an uncomfortable, cautious view on the impact of lockdown offshore. I know we have a minimum crews. I know we're pushing backlogs to a place where we perhaps can do them as a combined work front, typical turnaround season or so on and so forth. But I think we have to be mindful that the place where normalization is most likely to happen first is where it's actually present. So if you default or postpone things long enough, it will become the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a fresh pair of eyes to go and look through long-term isolations, so on and so forth. And I think one thing that we don't do enough of, and I think it's being addressed, is we need to walk the line of sight for hydrocarbon containing vessels in pipework before we reinstate or before we do any invasive sort of inspection. I think we have to be on our guard all the time. COVID has been a huge distraction. I genuinely believe we've got a bit of work to do in preparing people to go back out to do the inspections and back up. So I think that's a concern that most people in this industry would have. And it's good that we think about it because it avoids it becoming normalised.
Kind of related to that question, question from Peter Kyra saying, with the increase in hydrocarbon releases within the industry, what do you think we need to do in order to reduce these? He says he remembers the Play Your Part videos in 2009, and they had a great impact within the industry, reducing releases by 50%. He feels that some recent events are worrying for the industry and would be interested in your thoughts on this.
So my thoughts are that twofold, actually. One, we now record the minorest of non-hydrocarbon releases. In fact, if you spill a cup of oil over the side or some fluid over the side and it has a hydrocarbon base, it will be classed as a hydrocarbon loss, a loss of containment. And I think while it's important when we think about that from an environmental point of view, I think what that does is it clouds the issue. I think we really have to focus on those leaks that have demonstrated the potential to escalate very quickly. I think, again, I will come back to a point I mentioned earlier. Operators need to be able to share and discuss these far more openly without the threat or the potential threat of being legally chastised for them. I think there has to be some degree of flexibility around being open and honest for the sake of improvement and for sharing. I think legal privilege is used to protect that too often. And I think, we have to become more focused on hydrocarbon releases rather than just spills in general, because I think it just becomes clouded. There's a slight increase in larger loss of containments. That would be worrying.
Another, just to pick up on all the questions on safety offshore, the other ones around process safety offshore from Tom Perry, and what is Step Change doing to help manage process safety offshore, especially with all aging assets and possibly restricted budgets?
Great question from Tom. I hope he's doing well. So process safety, I, along with Deirdre Mickey and the regulator, signed the Principles of Process Safety last year with the intent of committing to doing something significant in that area. The onset of COVID has completely wiped the potential for that happening, certainly in the near term. And my discussions with our leadership team and our board are that we do something significant towards the end of this year into next year around process safety. But what I would say is process safety is one of those areas that there is a relationship between OG UK and ourselves at Step Change in Safety. OG UK have a more focused technical approach to asset integrity, whereas my thrust, if you like, is around educating the workforce and what they can do to improve process safety. So Trevor Stapleton and I, OG UK, are looking to work together on this, but I think that will be an agenda topic for maybe a quarterly theme for next year.
Great. Sure, Tom would be involved with that. Coming back to your experiences, Steve, the question from Daniel Shaw, it says, thank you for sharing your experiences, which are really powerful. When you're in the middle of the storm with many things happening that could have many different effects, what advice would you give about how to quickly refocus from being reactive and in survival mode to being proactive and in a thrive mode?
So I have a rule of thumb, if you like. It works for me. I tend to focus on the things I have influence and control over, and the others that I don't become secondary. And if I relate that to Piper Alpha, I realised very quickly I could do nothing about responding to the events of that night, from attempting to mitigate the spread of fire or even mustering. But I knew I could take control of getting off that installation by doing things that I was in control of. And I've done similar things elsewhere, not so dramatic, but I think an example I would give is I faced what I would call a minor storm, where we'd almost had multiple fatalities at a well site as equipment was being loaded out. I took control by arriving on the site myself. I drove down to the site, and because I knew I could do very little about what had happened, but I knew I could do something about what was about to happen in the way of follow-up. And that demonstrated to me that I could have been reactive and said, right, we'll wait till we get the report, we'll wait till we find out what happened and so on. But actually I was there within 3 hours. It was a land site. And as a result of that, we were far more able to respond in a positive manner rather than a reactive manner. So I think, in short, really assess the things that you can control and make a difference in, and identify the ones that you need assistance with. And most likely, if you need assistance, there'll be a subject matter expert that can help you.
Great, thank you. Another question from Dan. He says, I see that Step Change and OSI have teamed up to provide mental health first aid awareness for energy sector workers. What feedback have you had on this new and very different training, and how do you see this developing going forward?
So, yeah, I talked about our reactions and controlling things that you have ability to control. We had been running mental health courses in the classroom certainly for the year, part year I'd been with Step Change and Safety, and we'd planned to run another series of those courses because they were very well attended. COVID happened, and immediately I was like, well, we need to do something different. And Brett at OSI, we spoke to them and said, could you do a virtual course for us? And what we did to ensure we thought it would work is I actually attended one of those courses right off the bat to ensure it, not that I'm a specialist, but to get a feel for the course itself. And I think we're now into our second series of courses, and the feedback from those that attend have been very, very positive and very supportive. Of course, you can't continue to do these courses alone, but what I would say is we've put our toe in the water to try and develop a resource that can be offshore, that can identify and support some folks that are actually struggling at this time. So what are we doing differently, or what do we plan to do going forward? We're actually working on an event. It will probably be a podcast type event, or a number of them, that is going to focus on what good looks like in the way of the mental health continuum. What do you do to identify where you're at? What would you do to respond to situations that you find yourself in personally? And it's about how you cope and how you build resilience along the mental health continuum line, because we all find ourselves on a daily basis either to the right or the left of that center point, and the ideal position is that you can identify that you're slipping, or you've got contributing factors that you can deal with. So we're working on a program for that. It won't be an attended program. It will be some form of podcast or a series of videos that we'll be launching, and we're having some really interesting people who have had mental health challenges in the past and are now in a better place. And it'll be interesting to see what the response from the industry is when we eventually get there, which will be, I think it'll be the second half of this year before we get to it. I think we're going to do it as part of our Q4 personal responsibility for safety theme.
Fantastic. I think anything that we do, to raise awareness of mental health is, extremely important. I think a lot has been done this year just because it's, impacted everybody, but it's such an important topic, ongoing. And we actually did a previous Knowledge Bites for Business focusing on mental health just a few weeks ago. Very conscious of time, Steve, so I'm just going to ask you one last question, and those that we haven't got to, I apologise, and we will see if Steve can answer these afterwards. So that question to end on, can you tell us a bit more about the work you're doing at the Pound for Piper Trust and how people can support this trust going forward, Steve?
Yeah, so Pound for Piper Trust is there to support the upkeep of the monument and the gardens. And the work we're doing right now is we've had, the garden has been as it is now since 1991 or 2, I think it was. And we've actually invested in plans to refurbish the entire site. And we have 2 options that are, they're going to cost a bit of money, but we're in a place where we've been raising funds over the last few years. We've got some capital that we can invest in that, but we can't do that without assistance from a beneficiary, if you like, or a benefactor, sorry. And I genuinely believe right now, and so did the trustees, that this is not the time to be going canvassing for additional funds when there's so much other needy situations going on. But so what we're doing right now, the council are responsible for the upkeep of those gardens to a general standard. We are more than willing to assist them when there needs to be a significant renewal of perhaps benches, roses, or gold leafing the statue and so on and so forth. And we are now talking about what we will do for a service this year, because I think it's important that we don't let that legacy leave us. There are still many who are affected by it, but also it acts as a catalyst for us in the way of reminding us of how hazardous that environment is out there and the potential that exists if it all goes awry. So that's what we're doing. We continue to push. If people want to assist us, they can go to the Pound for Piper website, www.poundforpiper.com, or they can get us on our Facebook page, or in fact, they can get in touch with me directly and I'll put them in touch with a trustee representative if need be. So a great question. I'm glad that people are thinking about it. We have plans for the gardens that just can't be enacted right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. That's been a really insightful hour hearing about your life and the impact it's had on everything that you've done, and also some great advice that you've shared with the group today. So I just thank you for myself, and I'm sure from everybody that's watching today. And thank you to everyone that's joined us today as well. We've had a great audience, some really interesting questions as well. The recording of today's webinar will be available on the RGE Knowledge Bites for Business web pages next week. And our next webinar is taking place on Tuesday, 6th of April, and is looking at ageism in the workforce. So very different topic. And more information can be found on the website. So without further ado, I'd just like to say thank you again very much. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.
Thank you for the opportunity, Sarah. Much appreciated, and you have a good day. Thank you very much.